Hey, thanks, Trevin. Yes, I'm here with Darshan. I have to ask you, a pretty long-fought series. How are you feeling after that, now moving to 3 and 5?
I definitely think that was like a huge game to win for us, because if we lost that, we would have been looking at like relegations and things like that, and we would have been able to like have such a good chance to make the playoffs. So it's a huge relief to win that game. It was a hard-fought series. P1 played pretty well, but I'm definitely glad we could come out with the win.
Yeah, and that does move you guys to 3 and 5 as you try to push towards playoffs. And a lot of people have been asking about your improvement or when CLG is going to kind of turn it on. We've heard from Afromio as champion pools having to change the way you play the game. How do you feel that's going?
I feel like, especially with this last week, we're realizing more and more about play styles and kind of like how we want to play the game, like having pressure. And like you're seeing like the lethality champs like Jace mid and things like that are just insanely strong. And I feel like if we play more towards the early game and play more towards having advantages early, we can snowball a lot better. But we've just been, I feel like, drafting more towards for team comps rather than trying to win the game early. And so I feel like we haven't really been playing towards our style. And I think going forward, we're definitely going to change that up.
Yeah, and I do have to actually ask you about that. I've noticed you guys really prioritizing Maokai very heavily for you for initiation. Does that kind of speak towards the initiation, or is that something else entirely?
Maokai is just pretty broken, honestly. Like, probably the easiest top laner to play, strongest tank, can like 1v5 the whole team for like 10 seconds. So, of course, you're going to lock it in if it's up most of the time.
All right, well, thank you very much, Darshan. Congratulations on the victory, and best of luck next week. For now, we're going to send it back to the desk.
Thank you very much, Jack. Wish you were here. Unfortunately, I'm alone with Mark. I know last time I complimented you, this time it's hate. Because, hey, CLG won. It's counter logic, all right?
Sure, why not? That works.
Had to flip it one around. But an interesting match, to be sure, and an interesting game as well. Counter logic gaming coming out ahead. And we're going to start, actually, with just the replay of the game-winning team fight, essentially, the one that got CLG the win. And it's the 3v5 Baron defense.
Right, and this basically starts off with a combination between Darshan and 6A being able to pick Adrian. Inori is over the wall by himself, not well coordinated with the rest of the team. Then Ryu goes too far on his own. 6A was able to barely kite out, and now just very, very quickly becomes a 2v3, and now P1's on the run for their life, trying to keep Arrow alive. Smithy does a good job jumping onto Arrow, takes the blast cone over. The two of them end up isolated on the other side of the wall, and Darshan's able to pick up the kill before the other two basically finish off Zig. But that was a really important moment in the game because CLG had been winning the whole game, then they had lost a couple fights, and that was basically P1 saying, okay, we want to fight. We have 5 men up versus 3, let's take a Baron. Yeah, and you know, CLG did the best they could. Ended up being a 5-0, which is, of course, incredibly unlikely, and it was just several mechanical misplays, one after the other. And so, you know, unlike for Phoenix 1, I think they obviously could have won that game, but it went the way it did. Counter Logic Gaming, I think, had some interesting things happen for them. We can start with the draft, actually, with what happened here, because they got themselves the Gangplank top, and you heard the commentators talk about it. There's like, oh, a whole bunch of bans got spent at Darshan, the person, just to give him Gangplank and Hashem, which is a great matchup in the first place. Right, and I think this is the first time Darshan has played the Gangplank and Hashem, but he also has shown that he can play other things too. He has the Trundle or something, and I'm sure he has a handful of pocket picks. That's always something Darshan has always had. And so it is a little strange to see the focus on Darshan there, and he plays the GP, struggles a little bit early, but that's GP. Like, back in the day, if GP was getting solo killed twice by Gnar, that was like, great. That's what we want. And then I'll farm up and I'll be a monster in the later game. So it doesn't matter how far GP falls behind as long as he's getting his farm, which Darshan was, and the rest of CLG was winning, picking up objectives. So he was in a fine spot. And then once it came into the mid-late game, he had a monster performance in team fights. He really did. And you can see in the draft order there, right? Yes, Rengar left up to be first picked. To be fair, Rengar was probably the least important champion on the CLG lineup. Say, please, here, let me dangle this kitty toy in front of you and you know, expect he does this and pause at it just to take the Shen away and take the Varus, and it's just, you know, it wasn't enough to keep everyone else down. Right, that part of the draft phase I thought was all right from P1. I mean, Rengar's still going to do Rengar things. You can't stop him from ulting and jumping, and he was useful, but he wasn't like the huge threat Rengar, and Inori definitely, I would say, outplayed Smithy for a majority of that game, though it wasn't always clear because Smithy was on the winning end. So but Inori played a number of team fights really well. So I think that trade was fine overall for P1. So you mentioned the fact that CLG got a lot of winning fights. 13 minutes in, we got another replay to show up here. When this is where the CLG snowball really started. This flash over from Alchemy sets up and everyone dogpiling in. And this is one thing that they did have was some pretty good target engage with him or with 6A. Yeah, especially in the beginning of the game, they're able to chase through onto the bot lane members of P1 now and clean up a couple kills. And I think the big thing is whenever Afro's out of lane, you see him making a ton of great plays. And it's those like in-lane kind of brain dead plays we were talking about from the second game where he just died for no reason. This time, starts to play off and is able to actually play the majority of this fight really well, as it gets kind of crazy with kills coming in everywhere. Ultimately, Inori respawns after dying initially, comes back in and cleans up 2 more kills for his own life again. So it ends up being a 4 for 2 at the end of that crazy fight. But I mean, CLG did control the early game with a number of fights before you see close to that 30-minute mark. Once again, P1 starting to win those mid and late game team fights.
Look at the damage graph. Darshan topping the game by like a 50% margin over a lot of other champions here, more than in some cases. And that's what we finally got to see. Is like, feels like when Darshan's on a carry, it often looks really good. Like there was the one kind of rough Jace top game where he won lane and CLG kind of threw in the end. But it feels like when Darshan's just playing a carry type, it just looks like Counterlogic Gaming end up closing these games out a little bit better. And we can start talking about players to highlight really, because we prepped the fact that there seem to be 3 big carries in this game. And with Phoenix, why don't we start with Inori, who did look very good, right? His Kha'Zix was great, and he said, yes, go ahead and take Rengar. We want to take Darshan's Shen away, and we'll just play Kha'Zix Rengar, no problem. And Inori looked better than Xmithie the entire game on a weaker champion.
Right, and the problem for P1 seems to stem around their Baron plays. All 3 games this series, they had Baron problems. They had Baron problems in previous matches as well, so they need to focus on that for improvement, because the rest of their game seems pretty solid. Usually they have good early games, this time not quite so much. They usually have good team fighting. Arrow's a great carry. He got abused a little bit this time, stuck on the immobile Varus. So overall, P1 seems really strong, and Inori in particular seems like he's going to get off the ground almost every single game, even when things aren't going well early.
Yeah, so he can always continue to be the rock for the team, but P1 maybe needs some better shot calling and better late game coordination to make that work a little bit better. Talk about other players who did really well. Stixxay was really big on the Jhin. It's kind of interesting that, you know, when P1's first 2 picks were to take away a top lane or take away a bot lane, it's, you know, the top lane and the bot lane that still does the best for CLG, and Stixxay's Jhin was absolutely amazing.
Right, and CLG seems to have a little bit of that Team Liquid syndrome where, like, as soon as one player starts playing well, the rest of the team struggles a little bit more. So even though this was a great game out of Darshan and Stixxay also was a monster in a lot of these team fights, having really good positioning. That's still the case where Xmithie looked worse and Huhi looked worse. And they had their moments too. Like there were a couple good packages out of Huhi, and there were a couple bad plays out of Stixxay as well, where he Jhin ulted and hit basically nothing. So overall, just there's this huge consistency problem on the side of CLG, not just between games, but within a game as well.
Yeah, and of course, as we crescendo up to players who are doing well, we end with the player of the game. No surprise here. Darshan on the top lane on the Gangplank. The bans don't seem to phase him. Really did beautifully. And he carried the actual team fights. I mean, significant damage percentage, decent KP. And the fact that he was able to just, like, half the time he engaged the fights with his ult. He's like, oh, we're going to run at them? Slow them down. Let's go, boys. Dive in there, put in another grab.
I think that's a great point, because the coordination with the global ult of GP can sometimes look awful, where you just ult behind the enemy team, they just like run forward and kill yours, or you know your Malzahar flash ults and you drop your ult in on this guy who's already dead. It felt like most of the time that Darshan was getting his ults off, they were well timed and they had impact in the game, not just random. I'll throw that in as well because I have this global ability.
Yeah, and there's actually just kind of fun synergy thinking about the comp, where it's like, okay, you want to spread out or at least run away from the Gangplank ultimate, but at the same time you want to stay in some kind of a weird line or dash sort of thing, so you can block Jhin ulti, and then someone's got to face tank the Rengar leap as well. You've got to be around to block it all off, and so, you know,
a lot of damage on CLG. Yeah, it's hard to play against.
A lot of damage, and they all have different positioning requirements that don't always overlap in the same way. So, you know, allowed them a lot of these early picks, and hey, it was a good game by CLG. They closed it out in the end, and they got their match win, which makes CLG improve to only 1 match win behind a tie for 4th.
And there's a handful of teams sitting at 4-4 now with Immortals, P1 going there. So, you know, as bad as CLG has looked in some of these series, they've also looked well, really strong in a couple against TSM in particular was one that they looked pretty good, and C9 as well. So I think you can say that, you know, CLG, there's always that kind of faith component, always believe in the potential, all that stuff. And I think it's another season of that where once again they have shown glimpses of their former glory, but they just aren't quite there yet.
All right, well, we'll see if that former glory does return, but now we're going to go and take a break after our first series because we have our match of the week coming up. It's FlyQuest going